よいしょ。22歳のウクライナ力士のこと聞いた？
Yeah, he's climbing up the ranks real quick.
そう。
But here's what I got stuck on. Every single time a foreign wrestler gets near the top of this sport, some corner of Japan starts talking about it like it's a national emergency, calling it literally
黒船。
black ships.
でもさ、あれって1853年にアメリカの軍艦に開国を攻められた時に使った言葉だよね。
Yeah, so a wrestling match gets compared to the moment Japan lost control of its own borders.
でも大げさじゃない？だってただの相撲ってかスポーツじゃん。
That's what I thought too. But I looked into this, and sumo isn't just Japan's national sport. It might be the closest thing this country has left to a living religion.
どういうこと？
Interesting, right? So I went back, not to 2025, not even to the Edo period. I went back 2,000 years to a fight between two gods.
神？
So, according to Japan's oldest surviving book, the Kojiki, written in 712 AD, thousands of years ago, two gods had a contest of strength, Takemikazuchi and Takeminakata. Takemikazuchi won, and he grabbed Takeminakata's arm and threw him. That single move, grabbing an arm and throwing, is a technique still used in sumo today. And that's why this myth is considered the oldest written record of sumo. But here's the first twist. In Kojiki, the word sumo is never actually used. It just says the two gods had a power contest. It was later generations, including the modern Japan Sumo Association itself, looked at that one motion described in text and said, that's the same technique we sumo wrestlers use. That's the origin of sumo. The myth didn't declare itself the origin of sumo. Sumo, looking backward, claimed the myth. But if you think about it, that raises an obvious problem. Humans wrote the Kojiki, which means whoever wrote the gods had a power contest already had to know what kind of contest this looked like. And we actually have physical proof of this. In Wakayama, archaeologists excavated a clay figure called Haniwa from a 6th century burial mound. That's more than 200 years before the Kojiki was written. And this Haniwa looks like a man over a meter tall, wearing a loincloth, arms extended forward, and legs planted wide in an unmistakable wrestling stance. This Haniwa is called a Danshi Ritsuzo Haniwa. And it's not just this one that looks like it's wrestling. Across Japan, archaeologists have found roughly 30 Haniwas that look like it's wrestling, all dating from the late 5th to late 6th century. The purpose is said to be a guardian of the dead, but we're not too sure of this. Fast forward just a few years later from when the Kojiki was written. The second oldest book in Japan, the Nihon Shoki, was written in 720 AD. In it, it states that in 469 AD, a master carpenter named Inabe no Mane was so skilled that he could plane timber all day without once nicking his blade. He boasts that he never makes a mistake. So Emperor Yurek puts his skill and his pride to the test. He orders court ladies to strip down to their loincloths and wrestle in front of Mane. Mane looks up, his blade slips. The emperor, who has deliberately disrupted his concentration, sentences him to death for his arrogance. But before the execution, Mane is ultimately spared. And that scene, that specific scene of where ladies are wrestling in only loincloths, is where the character of sumo appears in Japanese writing for the first time. And it is also one of the earliest written records of the distinctive wrestling attire that sumo wrestlers wear in the ring. There's another battle worth mentioning in Nihon Shoki. It writes that in 23 BCE, a man named Nomi no Sukune was ordered to fight a man named Taima no Kuehaya. Sukune won by kicking his opponent's ribs until they broke, then stomping his hip until he died. Not a sport, a duel to the death, fought almost entirely with kicks. Not the sumo that we know of today, but in Nihon Shoki, it specifically says that this was a sumo match. And what this actually tells us is that sumo back in the day was not what we see every day today. Pretty much everything was okay to do. There were no ring, no formal technique, just a brutal fight with no rules, and one that people sometimes died. As time went by, sumo was used in two different ways. The first is agricultural. In 1726 AD, after a drought ruined the harvest, Emperor Shomu sent priests to pray at 21 shrines across the country. And the following year, the harvest actually came in good. So, sumo was performed at each shrine specifically as a thank you to the gods. That single act of thanks is what shrines all over Japan then adopted as an annual ritual. And over centuries, thanking the gods for a harvest already received quietly turned into something else. Performing for a harvest not yet arrived. Which is why many of these matches weren't really contests at all. The outcome was arranged in advance. A wrestler from a town worried about its harvest would simply be allowed to win. At Oyamazumi Shrine in Ehime, they still do a version of this today. A single wrestler fights an invisible rice spirit, and by design, loses every single ear. This was never really a way to predict the future. It was a way to perform the future you wanted and hope the performance made it real. Now, the second direction sumo went had nothing to do with rice or gods or gratitude. It had to do with palace security. In 719, the court had created an official position whose entire job was scouting strong men from the provinces. And the way they did it was the emperor would watch a sumo match held around July as a festival entertainment. But this was also a selection process for the emperor's palace guards. Roughly 40 men were selected every year, and here's the detail I love. There was pretty much no referee. As I told you before that sumo back in the day had no rules, there was a chance and probably some incidents where the contestants were killed during the battle. To solve this problem, the court brought in a man named Shigano Seirin. He banned striking, kicking, and punching, and replaced it with 48 named techniques built around throwing, tripping, twisting, and bending. The same 4 categories a wrestler uses today. Here's the thing though, Shigano Seirin does not appear in any official history of the period. No court record, no chronicle. He shows up centuries later in sumo's own internal training manuals, which is why some scholars think he may be entirely fictional. Sit with that for a second. The man credited with writing sumo's rulebook might be a story sumo told about itself to give its rules a founder. For centuries, sumo stayed inside shrines and the imperial court. Then, in the late 16th and 17th centuries, something changed. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines started organizing public tournaments to raise construction funds. You see, there were so many civil wars going on just before then because it was the Sengoku era, and temples and shrines were destroyed all over the place. But once the Sengoku era ended, the temples and shrines needed a way to reconstruct their buildings and site. They needed money. So sumo matches were held inside temples and shrines, and entrance fees were collected to watch the matches. Sumo was essentially used as a fundraiser. This is called kanjin zumo. Professional sumo was not born in a palace or a rice field. It was born as a fundraiser for buildings that needed a new roof. But there was one problem. Remember those rules made by Shigano Seirin? Well, those rules only applied to the sumo that was held inside the imperial court. People outside the imperial court didn't know about these rules. So matches were quite brutal, and the audience got into a fight, and it was quite chaotic. The government banned sumo many times, but people still kept on holding this event. And in 1684, the government finally legalized sumo with the restriction of having it twice a year, in spring and fall, on the condition that wrestlers must come from a real professional organization with actual management. And the first tournament was held at Tomioka Hachiman Shrine. And from there, for decades, Tournaments rotated between shrines across the city. Then, once the shogunate lifted restrictions on where sumo could be held, the sport gravitated toward wherever the crowds already were. And by the 1760s, that was the riverside district of Ryogoku, already famous for its firework and its nightlife. In 1768, the temple there, Ekoin, hosted its first major tournament in the same neighborhood where Japan's National Sumo Stadium stands today. Now, here's the section that changed how I see this entire sport. When Japan rushed to modernize and impress the West in the Meiji era, sumo nearly didn't survive. In 1872, the government banned public nudity, worried it made Japan look uncivilized to Western eyes. And sumo wrestlers, who fought nearly naked, were an obvious target. Newspapers seriously debated whether sumo should simply be abolished as a relic of the old world. What actually saved sumo wasn't national policy. It was one man's personal taste. Emperor Meiji happened to love sumo, and in 1884, he attended a match himself. That single royal appearance was enough to reverse its fortune. A tradition that Japan's own government had almost let die in its rush to look modern survived because the man at the very top of the government wanted to keep watching it. And once sumo had survived by attaching itself to the emperor, it started acting like something sacred again, not something that had almost been thrown out with the rest of old Japan. With that status came a hardening of the rules around who was allowed near the ring. Women were barred from the ring, and that exclusion was defended, formalized, and enforced well into the 20th century, justified through Shinto ideas about ritual purity. Which is really strange because the very first time the word sumo was written down in Japanese history was when it was describing women wrestling. The sport that would spend the next century insisting women defile its ring got its own name from a scene where women were the wrestlers. Which makes what happened next so interesting. In 1964, a massive teenager from Hawaii named Jesse Kuhalua arrived at a sumo stable in Tokyo. 4 years later, under the name of Takamiyama, he became the first foreign-born wrestler to reach sumo's top division. He wasn't just tolerated, he was loved. His success opened the door to a wave of Hawaiian recruits through the 80s and 90s. Two of them, Akebono and Musashimaru, did something no outsider had ever done in the sport's entire recorded history. They reached Yokozuna, Grand Champion, the single highest rank in sumo. A couple years later, wrestlers began arriving from Mongolia, whose own centuries-old wrestling tradition, bulk, made the transition to sumo almost unnervingly smooth. Since the year 2000, 6 out of 8 wrestlers promoted to Yokozuna have been Mongolian, not Japanese. This is when Japanese sports media started reaching for that word, kurofune, black ships. A direct reference to 1853, when Commodore Perry's American warship forced Japan to abandon 2 centuries of deliberate isolation at gunpoint. Which brings us back to Fukuoka, November 2025, a 21-year-old Ukrainian throwing a Mongolian-born Yokozuna out of a ring. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nothing about this sport was ever actually fixed. The myth didn't invent sumo. Sumo utilized the myth centuries after the fact to give itself a father. The word sumo first got written down in story about ladies wearing only loincloths, not warriors. The man credited with writing sumo's rulebook might never have existed. The thing that saved sumo from extinction wasn't tradition. It was one emperor's personal hobby. Every single piece of this ancient unchanging sport was rewritten. And every time, once enough years have passed, Japan just quietly starts calling the result a tradition. Aonishiki didn't break that pattern by winning in Fukuoka. He's the latest entry in it. And probably in a few decades, whatever he does next just becomes one more thing sumo eventually calls a tradition. If you like this kind of hidden history and culture of Japan, like and subscribe, and leave a comment on what kind of video you want me to create next. ご視聴ありがとうございました。